Have you ever watched people in a crowded room instinctively gravitate toward one particular man? Not the loudest, not the most physically impressive, not the wealthiest or most famous, but a man who carries himself with an unmistakable quality of presence that others can sense but rarely name. This man moves differently. While others' gazes dart hungrily from body to body, his remains steady and direct. While others' attention fragments between what they're saying and what they're trying to get, his focus stays undivided. While others perform, alternating between dominant posturing and desperate approval-seeking, he simply exists, comfortable in his own skin. Women respond to him differently too. They relax in his presence, their guards lower. They share thoughts they rarely express with other men. Not because he's employing manipulation tactics or dominance displays, but precisely because he isn't. His energy demands nothing from them. His attention doesn't drain them. His presence doesn't require their performance. What sets this man apart isn't a technique. It's a fundamentally different relationship with the energy flowing through him. In a world where 90% of men remain identified with and driven by their sexual impulses, he possesses something revolutionary, a desexualized mind. This doesn't mean a neutered, repressed, or powerless mind. Quite the opposite. It means a consciousness that has differentiated itself from blind identification with sexual drive. A mind that feels desire, perhaps even more intensely than before, but is no longer possessed by it, no longer unconsciously driven by it. Carl Jung, that great pioneer of depth psychology, recognized this distinction as fundamental. He wrote, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, there love is lacking. The one is the shadow of the other." The desexualized mind is not about eliminating power or desire. It's about integrating them consciously rather than being unconsciously driven by them. Look around you. Billboards featuring bodies sell everything from perfume to hamburgers. Entertainment reduces women to visual consumption. Social media algorithms feed on and amplify objectification. Society bombards men with messages designed to keep them identified with lust, their psychological energy constantly pulled into their lower centers. This isn't accidental. Unconscious men make ideal consumers. They follow predictable patterns. Their attention can be captured and monetized. Their insecurities can be weaponized to sell products promising the very power they've given away. The system doesn't want you conscious. It profits from your blind identification. Jung saw this societal pattern decades before it reached today's extreme. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he warned that the gods have become diseases. The archetypal energies humans once channeled through myth, ritual, and religion don't disappear when denied. They become pathological. The sexual instinct, divorced from its sacred dimension and reduced to mere biological drive, becomes an obsession, a compulsion, a source of unconscious identification rather than conscious participation. In this environment, the man who achieves even basic psychological differentiation stands out dramatically. His presence communicates something entirely different, something genuine, attentive, and whole. This quality becomes increasingly rare and therefore increasingly valuable. The desexualized mind functions as modern man's greatest weapon in multiple dimensions. First, it liberates you from internal forces that have kept you imprisoned in unconscious patterns. Second, it establishes your presence as distinctive in a world of reactivity. Third, it transforms how others, particularly women, experience and respond to you. Women sense when a man's mind is no longer driven primarily by lust. The man whose awareness remains fused with sexual drive broadcasts his intent without speaking. His eyes linger too long on bodies rather than connecting with the person. His attention drifts during conversation, searching for opportunities. His energy carries an unspoken demand that women exist primarily for his satisfaction. Women's bodies register this predatory quality even when their minds rationalize it away. They tense, they guard, they keep emotional distance. They may not articulate it, but their nervous systems know precisely what they're dealing with. Another man who sees them as means rather than beings. Jung understood this dynamic through his concept of anima projection. In Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, he explains how men project their inner feminine, anima, onto actual women, seeing not the woman herself, but their own unconscious content. The undifferentiated man doesn't see women as they are. He sees screens for his projections, vessels for his fantasies, solutions for his inner emptiness. The woman feels this projection landing on her. It's a weight, a reduction, a demand that she becomes something other than herself. But when you develop a desexualized mind, something remarkable happens. Women feel safe in your presence, not because you're weak or sexless, but because they sense you see them completely. Your gaze holds steady with theirs. Your attention remains on their words, their essence, their being. Your energy carries no hidden agenda. This safety allows women to open in ways they rarely can with most men. They share more freely. They express themselves more authentically. They relax into genuine connection rather than remaining vigilant against potential exploitation. Not because they've consciously analyzed your intentions, but because their intuition, far more sophisticated than conscious thought, registers that they are being seen rather than consumed. What Jung called the process of withdrawing projections is at work here. As you integrate your own anima rather than projecting it outward, you develop the capacity to see women as they actually are. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. This transformation becomes possible only when projection ceases, when you stop using others as screens for your unconscious content. Have you noticed how women seem magnetically drawn to men who aren't desperately seeking sexual validation? How they chase men who don't chase them? This isn't a technique or strategy. It's a natural consequence of psychological differentiation. When your consciousness isn't fixated on obtaining gratification, you communicate differently. You listen fully. You respond to what's actually being said rather than what might advance your hidden agenda. The irony becomes apparent. By releasing the desperate grip on sexual acquisition, you become more genuinely attractive. By ceasing to treat others as means to satisfaction, you establish authentic connection. What Jung understood, and what most men never grasp, is that differentiation from drives doesn't diminish power. It enhances it. This enhanced power extends beyond interpersonal dynamics. The undifferentiated mind lives in perpetual hunger. Satisfaction proves temporary at best, quickly replaced by renewed craving. The man identified with his lust never has enough, another conquest, another experience, another validation, yet remains fundamentally empty. But when you break this cycle, you discover contentment without acquisition. Your sense of worth no longer depends on what you can obtain. Your happiness no longer hinges on fleeting gratification. You discover that you already possess what you truly need. This state corresponds to what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to create a third position that transcends opposing forces. In the transcendent function, Jung describes this as a way of attaining liberation by one's own efforts and of finding the courage to be oneself. The desexualized mind doesn't repress sexuality, nor does it indulge it unconsciously. It transcends the opposition between repression and indulgence, establishing a higher unity that includes both restraint and expression in their proper measure. This contentment transforms every action. What previously served only your desperate need for validation now becomes genuine service to others. Your work, your relationships, your creative output, all shift from self-gratification to authentic contribution. Not because you've suppressed your needs, but because you've integrated them within a larger, more comprehensive identity. Have you noticed how life responds differently to men who act from wholeness rather than fragmentation? Ancient wisdom recognized this principle. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. This operates psychologically through what Jung would recognize as synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that aren't causally connected, but reflect a deeper ordering principle. In synchronicity, and a causal connecting principle, Jung challenges the conventional Western division between mind and matter, suggesting that psyche and world are interconnected in ways rationalism cannot explain. The desexualized mind, having achieved greater internal coherence, naturally attracts external circumstances that reflect this coherence. Opportunities appear, relationships deepen, work finds meaning. Not because you're manipulating reality, but because your internal coherence naturally magnetizes external coherence. You become someone people inexplicably want to help, support, connect with, and open doors for. People sense this integrated state. They may not intellectually understand why they trust you, why they seek your counsel, why they remember what you say, but they respond to the integrated field of energy you've established. In a world where most men remain divided against themselves, wanting peace but creating conflict, seeking connection but generating isolation, claiming virtue but acting from shadow, you become remarkable simply by achieving basic psychological integration. Developing this desexualized mind doesn't mean eliminating sexuality or suppressing desire. It means establishing conscious relationship with these forces rather than unconscious identification with them. The sexuality of the differentiated mind is actually more powerful, more profound, and more fulfilling, because it flows from wholeness rather than desperation, from genuine connection rather than acquisition. The path toward this differentiated state begins with psychological objectivity, the capacity to observe your internal processes without immediately identifying with them. When sexual desire arises, you notice, desire is present, rather than becoming desire itself. This slight shift creates space between stimulus and response, space between feeling and action, space where choice becomes possible. This objectivity requires confronting your shadow, not just the shadow of sexuality, but all disowned parts of yourself, your weakness, your selfishness, your dependency. These rejected aspects don't disappear when disowned. They operate autonomously from unconsciousness, hijacking your behavior when you feel most out of control. Jung's concept of the shadow stands as one of his most crucial contributions to psychology. In Ion, researches into the phenomenology of the self, he writes, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. The desexualized mind first requires this moral courage, the willingness to see what most men spend their lives avoiding." Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Your shadow gains power not from its content, but from your refusal to acknowledge it. What you resist persists and controls you from behind the scenes. Alongside this shadow work, the desexualized mind requires strengthening the conscious ego, not inflating the ego, but developing it sufficiently to withstand the powerful currents of the unconscious. A weak ego becomes identified with whatever psychic content is most activated. A strong ego maintains its center while engaging with these contents without being possessed by them. As your ego strengthens and your shadow integrates, something remarkable emerges. The scattered fragments of your psyche gradually organize around a new center, not the ego, but something more comprehensive. The self, the archetype of wholeness, and the true regulating center of the psyche. Jung distinguishes carefully between the ego and the self. The ego is the center of consciousness, but the self is the center of the total psyche, including both conscious and unconscious dimensions. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung writes that the self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. The desexualized mind emerges through right relationship between ego and self, between the limited I of everyday awareness and the broader intelligence of the complete psyche. From relationship with this deeper self comes inner authority, no longer needing constant external validation because you've connected with an inner source of value and meaning. This inner authority is the foundation of genuine confidence, not the brittle confidence of the inflated ego, but the quiet certainty of a man who knows who he is. Jung wrote extensively about this process, noting that the attainment of the self is nothing less than the finding of God. not God as an external deity, but the God image within, the numinous center that brings order to the psyche. The self emerges as the new organizing principle of your psychology, a center that transcends and includes the ego. As Jung explains in his seminal work, The Ego and the Unconscious, the relationship between ego and self becomes the axis around which your entire psychological life revolves. The ego no longer identifies with the contents arising from the unconscious, but establishes a living relationship with them. This is what Jung called active imagination, dialoguing with the inner figures and energies rather than being possessed by them. These are not merely theoretical concepts. The Jungian process of individuation, becoming the unique individual you were meant to be, requires this fundamental shift in psychological orientation. You cannot individuate while remaining identified with your raw libido. The energy must be differentiated and directed consciously toward the goal of wholeness. This process isn't linear but cyclical. You won't achieve permanent differentiation through a single insight. You'll experience moments of clarity followed by regression into identification. This isn't failure. It's the nature of psychological work. Each cycle takes you deeper. Each recognition strengthens consciousness. Jung named this cyclical nature of psychological growth the circumambulation of the self, a spiral-like movement that repeatedly approaches the center from different angles. It is what he called the opus, the great work of psychological alchemy. In his seminal text, Psychology and Alchemy, Jung demonstrates how the ancient alchemists were not merely proto-chemists, but were engaged in the same psychological process we're discussing, the transformation of base material, undifferentiated libido, into gold, differentiated conscious energy. This alchemical process involves specific operations Jung identified in the symbolic language of alchemy: the nigredo, blackening, the confrontation with shadow, the albedo, whitening, the emergence of new consciousness, the rubedo, reddening, the reintegration of passion and instinct at a higher level. The desexualized mind corresponds to this third stage, not the elimination of instinct, but its transformation and integration. The rewards of this work manifest in every dimension of life. The quality of your relationships, particularly with women, transforms when you're no longer using others to fulfill unconscious needs. Your work becomes more meaningful when it flows from authentic purpose rather than compensation for internal emptiness. Your entire presence in the world shifts from taking to giving, from using to serving. This shift doesn't go unnoticed. In a world drowning in sexual objectification, the man with a desexualized mind stands as a refuge of genuine human connection. People sense this difference immediately, though they rarely name it. Women particularly respond to it, finding in your presence something increasingly precious: the experience of being seen for who they are rather than what they can provide. You become that man in the room everyone inexplicably gravitates toward, not because you've learned techniques or strategies, but because you've achieved something far more fundamental: psychological differentiation from the drives that unconsciously control most men. This is the weapon Jung understood. This is the power of the desexualized mind. This is what sets you apart in a world designed to keep men identified, reactive, and ultimately powerless. The question isn't whether this freedom is possible. It is. The question is whether you are willing to do what is necessary to claim it as your own. Because when you develop a desexualized mind, when you free yourself from blind identification with sexual drive, you don't become less of a man. You become what few men ever achieve: a complete human being. And in that completeness lies a power that others can only sense but never understand until they've experienced it themselves. So I ask you, how long will you continue living driven by forces you don't recognize? How long will you mistake your reactions for choices? How long will you remain fragmented when integration awaits? The path toward the desexualized mind isn't easy, but those who walk it discover what truly matters has been within reach all along. Your liberation begins with a simple shift in awareness, from blind identification to conscious relationship, from being possessed by your desires to engaging with them from a stable center. from psychological slavery to the freedom that comes only through consciousness. This shift changes everything. You change. And in that change lies the greatest power a man can possess, the power to choose his own path, to create his own meaning, to become the author rather than the subject of his existence. And the world responds, not because you're manipulating it, but because you've aligned with a deeper truth of human existence. The truth that wholeness attracts wholeness, that consciousness creates order, that the integrated psyche naturally magnetizes corresponding circumstances. Jung captured this principle elegantly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The desexualized mind reverses this equation. What was once fate becomes choice. What was once automatic becomes intentional. What was once driven from below now flows from above. This is the power Jung understood. This is the weapon modern man so desperately needs, yet so rarely possesses. To those who have, more will be given. This isn't mystical thinking, it's psychological reality. When your mind differentiates from constant identification with desire, you establish a field of coherence that attracts what resonates with it. Opportunities, relationships, meaning, purpose, not because you're seeking them, but because you've become the kind of being they naturally flow toward. Women feel this coherence instantly. They may not intellectually understand why they trust you when they don't trust others, why they open to you when they guard with others, why they remember your words when others fade. But their bodies know. Their intuition knows. They are in the presence of something increasingly rare, a man who sees them rather than uses them. This is the desexualized mind, modern man's greatest weapon in a world designed for unconsciousness. This is the freedom that awaits on the other side of differentiation. This is the power that comes not from controlling others, but from mastering yourself. The choice is yours. Remain identified and controlled by forces you refuse to recognize, or begin the journey toward psychological freedom, toward becoming the rarest and most powerful type of man alive today. One who has achieved basic differentiation in a world drowning in unconscious identification. Everything changes when you stop being controlled by undifferentiated libido. You change. And that change isn't the end of your power. It's the beginning of a power most men never experience, the power that comes from psychological wholeness.